All right, here we are for the third and final part of Chapter 23. We're just going to continue looking at the history of hominins and then wrap up with a little bit of current human variation. So we left off with the Australopithecines, and now we're going to see that 200 million years ago, or excuse me, 2 million years ago, we see the genus Homo finally appearing in the fossil record. And characteristics that science has decided to use in order to call a fossil in the genus Homo is that the brain size needs to be greater than 600 cubic centimeters. There needs to be evidence of tool use found with the fossil, and then there need to be jaws or teeth in the skeleton, jaws and teeth in the skeleton, in the skull, resembling modern humans, which generally is to say that they're smaller, they have relatively small canines, and the jaw is not nearly as large as it might be in a gorilla that has a completely herbivorous diet versus in humans where we have an omnivorous diet. So in the past, folks have asked, like, what's evidence of tool use? How do you know that that's existing? And so this is kind of a list. If we actually find the tools themselves, if we find rocks that are shaped by force, rocks and sticks modified to fit together, evidence of fire, clothing, shelter, clay, or stone, those things were made with tools, burial areas with different items, scratch marks on rocks, cut marks on bones, cave markings. If animals are killed in the way that later Homo species would hunt them, locations by rivers or fertile vegetation and land kind of show that they were picking agricultural areas to live, and that was probably only possible with tools. Finding animal teeth in certain fashions, and then if you find piles of bones and teeth, that's really, really helpful because that's the garbage pile. So archaeologists are actually usually very excited when they find the garbage pile because this is where they have discarded their things. If you imagine 200 years from now someone went through your garbage, you know, what would they find? They'd find packaging, they might find a pen that you threw out, maybe they'd find a piece of clothing, which I would encourage you to donate instead of throwing out. But, you know, if you had that in their garbage, they would then find maybe your pen and they'd say, oh, what is this? This is something with a spring. Maybe it's a clicking pen. It has something inside that it can pull apart. You know, and they would try to figure out, did they use this for their hair? Did they use it to write? Were they using it to cook? You know, then they try to figure it out. So that's what garbage piles can actually be quite helpful. All right, so Homo habilis is kind of our first Homo species that we're going to look at. Notice it's italicized. It lived about 2 to 1.9 million years ago, at least according to the fossils that we found. It has no ape-only features, so it has some in-between features, but it does have some very specific Homo features, which is a very large brain. We think that this species was able to have speech, and we are estimating that or making that hypothesis because we can take imprints of the brain, imprints of the skull that would have held the brain, and we know in modern humans where the brain is activated when talking, when performing speech, and then when we compare that to the imprints of the cortex of this skull, we see that those areas of the skull are actually quite large. They have extra coils, or it's just a bigger space, and that indicates that that part of the brain was actually used relatively often, indicating that speech might have been possible. And with speech, then people can hunt cooperatively, they can gather, they can assign roles, so a little bit of culture is starting to occur. They had small teeth, indicating they were omnivores, and we found cuts on bones with the skeletons, or with the fossils. And it may have had culture because that requires communication. The next species to look at here is Homo erectus. So Homo erectus lived about 1.9 to 0.3 million years ago. It had a larger brain than Homo habilis, and it had a flat face with a projecting nose the skeletons of the fossils show us that it was actually quite tall with a very striding bipedal gait. You know, if you look at a chimpanzee, of course, it can walk bipedally. My dog can walk bipedally for a few steps, but, you know, it really had that first striding gait like you and I might have. Advanced tools and fire, we have evidence of that, showing that they were systematic hunters. We found lots of bones, again, in those garbage piles. And they may have also had a language. We've seen with the fossil record that they migrated from Africa out to Europe, Asia, and Java, which is an island that's part of Indonesia. Then we have Homo neanderthalensis. I always stumble there. They appear in the fossil record about 200,000 years ago. They had very large brow ridges, which is what we're seeing here. If you kind of feel your forehead down to your eyebrow, maybe there's a little bump there, but for the most part, then it just starts going into your eye socket, versus they would have had a very protruding brow ridge. They also had a nose, jaw, and teeth that protruded forward compared to modern humans and Homo sapiens. And they were very heavily muscled. And we know that they were heavily muscled because of their bone structure. The more you use a muscle, the more it pulls on that bone, and the larger that bone becomes to resist the tension that that muscle is placing on it. And so when we look at their fossils and we can see these very large bones right here, and we can see a larger one here and kind of along the eye as well, that's telling us that that is the result of being heavily muscled. We also see that in the rest of the body too. We just only have the skull here in this image. They did have a larger brain even than we do, and part of that we think is because they needed more brain. They just needed more neurons in order to control that much more muscle. They also had stone tools and prepared their food with fire, and they interbred with a Homo sapiens ancestor, because about 1 to 4% of modern humans' DNA is Neanderthal DNA. We have obviously DNA from Homo neanderthalensis, and when we compare that to humans, we have this small percentage that's the same. So Neanderthals did not interbreed with Homo sapiens, but one of the ancestors before Homo sapiens specifically appeared in the fossil record and on Earth even, we see that there was some interbreeding, which is why we have a little bit left over now. So Homo sapiens then appear in our fossil record about 100,000 to 40,000 years ago, and there's always going to be these ranges. We'll never know for sure, so that's all right. They're called Cro-Magnons. So the first Homo sapiens, just like you might call a group of people on planet Earth Americans compared to Europeans just based on where they live. What we're doing here is we're calling this group of Homo sapiens Cro-Magnons based on when they lived compared to what we might call modern day humans. So it's just a label we give our earliest Homo sapien ancestors. They had a very modern appearance, which is why they are considered our same species, because we essentially looked the same. They had very advanced culture, they had art and tools and language, and we know this again based on archaeological finds and what we see in the brain. Good cooperative hunters is what we're seeing based on, again, a lot of that art and tools. But very specifically, as a species, they did not interbreed with Neanderthals. But at that point, this species' ancestors already had bred with them, and some of that DNA, of course, had then been passed on. So that kind of walked us through the evolution of hominins over time. It's pretty cool. I find it fascinating. I've always thought it was really interesting to learn more about it, and every time National Geographic has a new article, I've been really excited to read it and see what else we know. What else do we find? What else do we know about? So what we're looking at now, as we find more fossils and more archaeological finds, just of tools or other things, people are starting to wonder, they've been wondering, how did we move across planet Earth? How did we get from Africa, because that's where we're finding all of our oldest fossils, we all technically, historically are Africans, and how did they then spread to everywhere on the planet? So the replacement model is one suggested model. It proposes that modern humans evolved from archaic humans only in Africa. And then today's modern humans, today's modern Homo sapiens, migrated to Asia and Europe, and when they arrived there, they replaced, essentially killed out, maybe they killed them, maybe they just outcompeted them for resources, we don't know, but they replaced the archaic species of humans about 100,000 years before present. BP just means before present. So that's what we're kind of seeing here, right? We had this initial migration of Homo erectus. Homo erectus shows up in these other spots. And then when the Homo erectus in Africa does eventually actually split into or develop into Homo sapiens, and then we just outcompete these other earlier Homo species. So that's one potential model. We do generally see this map on the right is showing us the general flow of how humans moved across the planet. For the most part, that's not super controversial. It's more just like a specific years of when they would have arrived somewhere is what people, for the most part, are debating. Some alternatives, though, to that replacement model is the question of, did we just assimilate other species into Homo sapiens instead of replacing them? We see Neanderthal DNA in our history. We see Denisovans are a group of humans that existed 1 million years ago, and they shared an ancestor with Neanderthals. And part of the reason we think that they were assimilated into Homo sapiens culture was that people who live in Oceania, those little islands, and people who live in really high elevation Tibet, when we look at their DNA, they have DNA that directly matches Denisovan DNA. So that's kind of telling us, okay, maybe this other group of humans were just assimilated when Homo sapiens appeared. They were part of the culture, they married in, they interbred, and then that DNA was passed on over time. Another suggestion is that, or another alternative, or question mark, sort of, is this species of Homo floresiensis. So this species, we have our fossils of them from about 18,000 to 12,000 years ago. They were all found on this one island of Flores, which is where their name comes from, and they were all 3 feet tall. They were a Homo species based on their other features, but they were all 3 feet tall. At first they thought they were just all kids, but that doesn't seem to be a likely explanation anymore. They think those are the adults. There's evidence that they used tools and fire and were cooperative hunters to kill large animals, again, because of those excellent garbage piles. And then the question is then, well, why are they so small? And one suggestion is that because they were on islands, natural selection, what we've seen in many other places is that organisms on islands are typically smaller than their mainland counterparts or their mainland ancestors, just to maintain the resources there, and natural selection selects for that. It could have been for Bergman and Allen's rule, and another suggestion was that everyone on this island just had Down syndrome. We, of course, don't know the actual answer, but these kind of raise some questions about maybe the replacement model isn't the only thing. Maybe it's not 100%. Maybe there's some other things. So again, scientists leaving room for future evidence to sort of guide what we can discover about the world. And so we want to wrap up by pointing out that humans are totally varied, even today. We all technically are of the same species, and that's why we can all interbreed. Sounds a little clinical, but it's still possible. We have a variety of ethnicities, and our variations are adaptations to our local environments, right? We see skin pigmentation ranging from dark to light based on how much UV light might be in that area and the availability of vitamin D. The body shape of mammals will change. There is no difference, though, in intelligence. So we definitely need to point out that it doesn't matter what you look like internally, externally. There's no difference in intelligence between humans, at least, in general. We can't say one group of people is less intelligent or more intelligent than another. People have tried, people continue to try to say it today, and science has absolutely no data to support that whatsoever. A couple of these rules that we mentioned on the previous slide are a little more related to this second point here, Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule. So both of them are just saying, these are kind of observations. What we've noticed is that mammals that live in colder areas tend to be bulkier than the mammals that are of the same species but further south. So moose was kind of our example earlier. Allen's rule is kind of pointing out that in colder areas we tend to see shorter limbs, shorter digits, smaller ears. We are kind of thinking that that might be a way to reduce the likelihood of frostbite or reduce the likelihood of losing heat through that exposure to cold. So there's always exceptions to these, so they're just general rules of thumb. And kind of this is kind of a precursor to where our next chapter is going, is looking at agriculture. You know, agriculture was this huge advantage that humans finally were able to perform. And once we figure that out, it really allows a population to grow. And if you're in a steady place, if you're in a stationary place because you're raising crops, you can have more babies, right? You have more food available to you. You aren't undergoing miles of walking or traveling, which of course certainly exerts a certain amount of stress on an expectant mother. And because you have more babies, now you're reliant on agriculture. Now you need that agriculture. So once we started, it kind of became this chicken and egg, or not chicken and egg, but once it started, it really became this kind of positive feedback loop of, okay, we're stationary, we have more babies, now we need more food, so we have to stay here, and now we can have more babies. And we've continued that ever since. And a big question that our world is facing right now is, can we still meet the needs of all of these people? Can we do it? Can we do it equally so that we don't have this massive distribution of some people being just fine and overnourished and other people, you know, being too hungry? So we certainly kind of mentioned that earlier in a discussion about hunger and poverty. So we're kind of going to get into, you know, we don't live in a bubble. And what does that mean for us? What does that mean for our individual bodies? But as a population of humans, what does that mean as well?